Hello, and welcome to our first online lecture of this virtual semester of History of Thought 102, HTH 1002, for the fall of 2020. I'm Kara Heintz, and I am your instructor for this pandemic semester. So today is going to be a little bit longer than a typical online lecture, just because it's sort of an overview that's also supposed to remind us maybe of some of the ideas you covered in History of Thought 1 about the Enlightenment, or maybe in other classes. So, bear with me. You can always stop, get a coffee, maybe a drink if you need it to get through the lecture, whatever you need. And we'll talk about the Enlightenment, okay? So the Enlightenment is perhaps the most major intellectual movement in the West in the past 200 to 300 years, whose ideas still reverberate through Western and global culture today. This intellectual movement takes place roughly from the early 1700s to the early 1800s. Its high point is sort of the late 1700s. So its high point is sort of coterminous with the American Revolution and also the French Revolution a decade later. With its emphasis on reason, on human rationality and individual rights and individualism. It's sometimes also referred to as the Age of Reason. It's central to sort of Western history and global history because many of the ideas that developed during the Enlightenment were challenging the power of traditional authorities, such as the Christian church, such as kings, the nobility, the old political hierarchical orders. And Enlightenment ideas underpin many modern political notions of individual rights, religious toleration and freedom, and human equality. So it's important to understand the intellectual origins of these because they're still incredibly important to our daily lives today, as well as understanding, which with this course is really going to focus on, a lot of the contradictions inherent in the proponents of these ideas. In other words, what does it mean to promote the equality of all men, as many of the U.S. founding fathers did, while also owning slaves? That's a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American democracy, which American democracy itself is in many ways indebted to Enlightenment ideas. So very briefly, why did the Enlightenment occur in the 1700s, mostly in Europe, but in the West? The US thinkers such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are also part of this, what's called Republic of Ideas that your reading talks about. So before roughly the 1600s, European cultures are really dominated by Christian medieval thought. Medieval Christian doctrine saw human reason and moral capacity as seriously flawed. Our human efforts should focus on getting to the afterlife and not on our earthly life. There's the acceptance of the authority of God, of religious leaders and institutions and political rulers as absolute. So not to say we don't have these kinds of authorities now, but medieval Christian thought and institutions is really an absolutist form of power. Do not question established ideas and learning. Developments in the 1600s in Europe increasingly bring these traditional authorities into question. The breakup of a unified church, right, the Catholic Church in Europe, with the spread of Protestant denominations. I mean, that's really starting from the 1400s onward, but by the 1600s, there's multiple denominations of Christianity in the West. There's also political revolutions that are occurring in the West in the 1600s that are starting to question the divine right of kings to rule and assert ideas of individual rights. The English Civil War in the 1640s, actually executed a king and put sort of a non-monarchical government into place for 10 years. The royalty was restored, but still a lot of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke are kind of coming out of this tradition of limiting the authority of monarchs and kings. Also, 100 and some change later in the 1770s and 1780s, you have the U.S. You have the revolution in the U.S. to break away from from Britain, right? And you have a decade later in 1789 to 1799, the French Revolution, where another king is beheaded and executed, and a democratic form of government is put into place. Although eventually you get Napoleon. So anyway, but you have these kinds of political revolutions that are taking place in the 16th and 1700s. So Enlightenment ideas just don't necessarily spring out of conversations, although lots of people are starting to gather in coffee shops. They're starting to gather in salons, which are events hosted a lot of times in France by wealthy women, where people would get together and talk about ideas. But it's not just talk. There's actually action on the street that had been taking place in terms of new ideas about challenging traditional authorities and sometimes overthrowing them, usually temporarily, but still often rather violently. You have the sort of coterminous with this, you have growing middle classes. So if you think about sort of medieval Europe, we often think about what's called the feudal system. And the feudal system is kind of the traditional interlocking system of relationships between the aristocracy, the king and the lords who own the land, and the vast majority of people, the peasants, who farm the land, who live on the land. And it's a hierarchical system in the sense that everyone is not seen as equal, right? There's a fundamental inequality built in, and it's very paternalistic, with the lords sort of as fathers over the peasants in a way. But it's a system of mutual obligation. It's not an individualistic system. It's a more community-based system where the lords and the aristocracy provide protection. They provide economic and security to the peasants, and in return the peasants pledge their loyalty. Maybe they'll fight in a war if they need to for that lord, and any kind of agricultural surplus also goes to the lord. So it's this system based on land of mutual obligations. You also have other groups in it, like the clergy and knights, who perform specific roles, but everybody has a very specific role, and 99% of the time you're born into that role, and not all roles are seen as equal. So all people are seen as unequal. With the more status you have, the more sort of worth that you are seen as having a human being, and often more intelligence. Often you're seen as having more sort of moral judgment, more reason, those sorts of things. So think Game of Thrones, think any kind of classic medieval fantasy book, TV series, movie. The social relationships that those often portray is the feudal system. And that's breaking down quite significantly, and it had been for a few hundred years, primarily because you have a lot of people in Europe increasingly who don't fit into those prescribed roles, that are often based around land. You have merchants, you have increasing international trade going on. This is the age of exploration, and increasingly the age of conquest, the age of colonialization. And you have a lot of merchants and business people who don't necessarily have a noble title, but who are getting, moderately well off, if not rich, from commerce. You also have people like lawyers and doctors. And as more and more people are moving to cities as opposed to agricultural areas, you have all of these kind of middling professions, shop owners, government employees, clerks, all these kinds of people that don't fit into that feudal system. And they're becoming more and more and larger in number. And pretty soon they're going to be the dominant class, later on. But and they don't have any political rights within these old orders. It's the people who are born with a title, the aristocracy, who have land. So part of this too, part of these political revolutions that you're seeing, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, 100 years before it, the English Civil War, is this new group of people who don't fit into this political order, but many of them actually getting quite comfortable, if not wealthy, off of business and commerce and related activities, demanding political rights. So another thing that happens in the 1600s to call a lot of traditional authorities into question, especially religious authorities, in particular, let's say religious views of the world, is the scientific revolution, which is taking place roughly in the 15 and 1600s. And this is where we get modern ideas about astronomy, physics, chemistry, medicine, biology, as well as the introduction of the scientific method, right? And formulating a hypothesis, testing it, to, formulating a hypothesis, accumulating evidence, testing it, right? And not just relying on what the church says or what Aristotle wrote down, but actually going out into the world and investigating it and gathering data and formulating hypotheses and then testing them ourselves. Of course, big figures in this are people like Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton. But in the 1600s, science in Europe is really an elite affair practiced by a very small part of the population. It's not affecting most people's daily lives. But the ideas of the scientific revolution begin to spread and become accepted by a wider audience by the 1700s. So when we're in the middle of the Enlightenment, it's really been influenced by the fact that the scientific revolution has been around for a while, has been creating all of this new sort of material world-based observations and data and conclusion about the world that we live in, and that you have middle class, upper classes, and increasingly this growing middle class sort of taking on this perspective. Right? This is incredibly, these ideas of the scientific revolution, the scientific method, become very sort of, let's say, mainstream at this time. And this is the context in which many of Enlightenment thinkers are coming from. So we'll talk specifically about Kant, about Mary Wollstonecraft, but in History of Thought 1 or other classes, you may have encountered people like Descartes or John Locke or Voltaire or Montesquieu, all of these thinkers. And we'll also be talking about Thomas Jefferson, who's included in the Enlightenment. This is the context. The world in the West had changed considerably in the past 200 years. And there's sort of widespread skepticism, especially among more educated people, about a lot of these traditional ways of viewing the world, be it sort of a church whose authority you don't call into question, or kings or aristocrats, as well as just accepting old ideas about the natural world, right? Those are called into question, that we should observe them ourselves. And if we're doing a live class, we would actually take some time to look at this painting and talk about it, but I can give you a little bit of an exposition and you can think about it yourself. So this is an experiment on a bird in the air pump, 1768 by Joseph Wright of Derby. And I think it really gives you a good idea about what's going on kind of at the peak of the Enlightenment in terms of the importance of the spread of these ideas of the scientific revolution to the middle classes. So Joseph Wright of Derby actually paints this scene. This is not London or in the middle of a big city. It's actually in sort of a middle-sized town in the north of England. So again, we're not in some sort of central metropolitan area. This is maybe like equivalent. This isn't in modern times equivalent to New York City. This is maybe like Omaha or Wichita, right? Or the equivalent thereof. And so what's going on? What is an air pump? So an air pump is actually a device that creates a vacuum. So the air pump is taking the air out of the glass chamber at the top. And as you can see, there's a bird in it. So as you remove the air and create a vacuum, what's going to happen? The bird's going to die, right? And this is an experiment, right? This isn't some sort of gruesome or, macabre ritual, right? This is a scientific experiment that's being conducted. And it's being conducted in sort of the parlor of a, let's say, upper middle class member of the gentry. So somebody who is one of these people of these growing middle classes who's probably accumulated a fair amount of material wealth, but they don't have a title, right? It's not lord or sir, or somebody like that. It's not an aristocrat. But they're having this gathering in their parlor to run a scientific experiment, and the kids are there. They've invited some neighbors over, right? This is the happening thing to do. This is what you do on a Saturday night in sort of mid-sized town north of England in 1768. If you're a well-educated middle-class person, you run a scientific experiment that kills a bird. But look at the picture and see what's going on, because I think it really shows you a lot of different attitudes in terms of the the spread of these ideas. You can see the couple or the two people on the left-hand side. They don't seem really interested, right? This is a social gathering. It's like, oh yeah, air pump experiment, sure, that's cool. Hey, did you hear what Betsy did yesterday? Did you hear who Jim was seen with right there? Gossiping, maybe flirting, who knows? It's interesting, there's a number of children also in the scene. You can see a child sort of in the lower left-hand side looking, kind of gazing sort of, I think, thoughtfully at the experiment. I really like the two girls, though, on the right-hand side, probably underneath what is their father. The one older girl is sort of obviously disturbed by what she's seeing. She's sort of, shielding her eyes. She doesn't want to see the bird die, which is probably what would have been considered traditionally appropriate behavior for a young lady. But I like her younger sister, who's sort of grasping and comforting her sister. And she looks like she maybe is a little reluctant or a little like, what's going on? But she's also gazing quite fixedly at the experiment. She's interested, she's curious. And this is one of the questions is, does universal reason also apply to women? Now, obviously, in 2020, we would say yes, but this is definitely something that is heavily debated at the time. And Joseph Wright of Derby is kind of showing us, I think both sides, right? What's traditionally expected of women, but also that girl who's interested. You have the boy on the right hand side who's sort of opening the window to let in the full moon, which is kind of a metaphorical statement, letting in the light of reason. And then the scientist who's conducting the experiment, right? He kind of has the wild mane of unkempt hair. He sort of has kind of that mad scientist look about him. But he's not looking at the experiment. Who's he looking at? Us. Right? He's inviting this into us again. He's inviting us into this experiment as well, the viewer of the painting. And I think what I like about this painting is how it really kind of shows you not only how widespread these ideas have become, but how much they're a part of sort of the social fabric of people's lives. So I'd like to go over some main principles of the Enlightenment. This might be a review for some of you, but just to kind of get these ideas out there. I'm not going to talk so much about the individual thinkers that are connected with them, but you might have done that, I think, in History of Thought 1, because we're not going to be reading a lot of people beyond Kant and Thomas Jefferson and Mary Wollstonecraft, but these are more the ideas that are out there. And of course, there's a lot of variation in these ideas, but this is kind of the basic Enlightenment 101 overview. And I think you'll see a lot of connections to things that are ideas that are quite predominant in our society now. So the first main principle of the Enlightenment is the idea of individual liberty. And we can kind of break that down into three sort of principles associated with individual liberty: religious toleration, political freedom, and individualism. So many Enlightenment thinkers are challenging traditional religious authorities, especially when connected to the state and the laws in the West. And so Enlightenment ideas are promoting sort of notions like states should allow freedom of worship and not have different laws for individuals of different religions. This is obviously familiar to us in the US context. Enlightenment thinking has a big influence on the founding of the US and on our Constitution. And obviously a lot of Europeans who are migrating to and colonizing the Western Hemisphere, part of the impetus for their movement is religious persecution of their denominations in Europe. But for many Western societies, Enlightenment religious toleration typically is about varieties of Christianity. So, for example, the French famous Enlightenment thinker Voltaire, wrote about his outrage at a famous case of a Protestant man who was accused a Protestant boy whose father was accused of murdering him because he wanted to convert to Catholicism, and the father was executed. And in his treatise on toleration, Voltaire is sort of outraged by this. But what we have to remember is we're talking about different flavors of Christianity. So Catholicism is the dominant flavor or variety of Christianity in France. And so a lot of toleration is really about we should tolerate other minority variants of Christianity, right? In the English context, it would be Episcopalians tolerating Catholics. And, I mean, that's really kind of what early America is about as well, a variety of different denominations of Christianity tolerating one another. There is some advocation of the toleration of Jews and the Jewish religion in Europe in Enlightenment thinking, but this is a hot topic that is debated throughout the 1800s. And of course, anti-Semitism in Europe has catastrophic consequences in the 20th century. So, some of the roots of anti-Semitism in Europe go back 1,000 years. But, anti-Semitism was so strong in parts of Europe that even Enlightenment thinking sort of had a big debate over where Jews should be tolerated in terms of their religion and given political rights. Many Enlightenment thinkers wanted to promote not just religious toleration, but secularism. And secularism is the idea that political life should be divorced from a religious perspective. In the US, we might say separation of church and state. Religion is a private matter, politics is public. And there's also this notion along with it that morality can be separated from religion. I think a really interesting example of this is Thomas Jefferson's approach to the New Testament of the Christian Bible. So Thomas Jefferson essentially took what we would call a 220-year-old X-Acto knife to the New Testament of the Christian Bible and basically cut out every single reference to anything that he saw as supernatural. So any sort of reference to miracles, to raising the dead, turning water into wine, that sort of thing, he cut it out. And you can see from the picture here, right? There's like just little cutouts in the text. And he kept everything that was essentially just about morals and ethics, right? The Sermon on the Mount. And we actually today call this the Jefferson Bible. And I believe until the 1950s, it was given to every new member of Congress. So it sort of has an interesting place in our history, right? That not that you should discard religion, not that from the perspective of people like Jefferson, you should discard Christianity, but that it's useful that you can sort of separate the moral from the supernatural. Another aspect of the principle of individual liberty is the idea of political freedom. And there's a wide spectrum of political opinions that were held by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like Voltaire, like Baron von Montesquieu, who we in our U.S. Constitution get the notion of the separation of powers, the three branches of government from. However, many both democratic and radical political ideas in the West during the 1700s are associated with the Enlightenment. Of course, what do we mean by radical, right? So in the late 1700s, the idea that, every white male who owns a little bit of property should get the right to vote is quite radical, right? But we should also recognize that even the ideas that would have been seen as radical at the time, there are still Enlightenment thinkers that are going even farther. For those more, what we would say today, more conservative radical thinkers, there are people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who we'll read, who are advocating for equal sort of, not necessarily political rights, but that women should be seen as being equally reasonable. And there are certainly other people that we will look at too these first few weeks who are not white property owning men who are using the language of the Enlightenment to articulate a demand for their rights. So things like constitutional and representative government, the separation of powers, individual rights, democratic values come from sort of this intellectual movement and inspired the American Revolution. I mean, if you look at the writings of John Locke, for example, a earlier thinker, late 1600s, but very influential to the Enlightenment, you can directly see the line from his work to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which we'll be reading for another class. So the American Revolution and the French Revolution were a direct outgrowth of Enlightenment ideals. And I think a really kind of interesting take on this, a really interesting kind of representation of this, is the statue of U.S. First President, Revolutionary War General, and Founding Father George Washington, a statue that the famous sculptor Houdon did of him in 1796. And it's Washington being presented as the famous Roman general Cincinnatus, where the city of Cincinnati gets its name from. And Cincinnatus was originally, he lived in the 5th century before the Common Era. He originally, in Rome, in the Roman Empire, he originally was a farmer. And because of some military experience, the Senate asks him to sort of be a general, right? They ask him to be a general and fight off there's an invasion happening. And because it's kind of wartime, he actually is sort of dictator for these 6 months that he's the head general. He has kind of absolute political power because it's sort of this emergency, right? So they grant him this. And he's successful. He's not so successful, he actually wins and fights off the invaders in 2 weeks. And the Roman Senate's like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. He's the height of his popularity. They're like, please stay on. And don't just stay on as a general or a member of the Roman Senate, but we want you to stay on as essentially dictator, right? We want you to stay on because you've done such an amazing job. We'll give up all our rights. He voluntarily gives up his power. He says no, and he goes back to being a farmer. And that's a very kind of Enlightenment sort of story, and parallels George Washington's own story, who, you know, after he is general of the U.S. Revolutionary Army and the U.S. Continental Army, he leaves his position and goes back to being a farmer. He comes back into public life to be president for 2 terms, but a lot of people wanted him to stay on for a 3rd term. There were even some people that were saying we should crown him king of the United States. And he again voluntarily, at the height of sort of his popularity and at a point where he probably could have seized a lot of power, leaves and goes back. Right? So you know, it's really about sort of not just creating a government that limits power, but the kind of people that rise to power in that system. And according to the story, Washington really embodies Enlightenment values. There's also another aspect of individual liberty is individualism, and I think the Washington story also very much aligns with that. That the emphasis on the moral is on the moral worth of the individual, not the group, not the class you're in. You know, not the group of people that in your place in the feudal system, right? Not whether you're a peasant or a lord, but it's on the moral worth of each individual. And that we should put the interests of the individual above some other collective or group, you know, such as your class or such as the state. Therefore, when trying to achieve religious or political liberty, the emphasis on individual rights and not group rights or community rights. So this idea often leads to a thing like the valorization of independence and self-reliance, which certainly can be a good thing, but sometimes can also be bad taken to extremes. So related to the centrality of the individual is a second overall principle of the Enlightenment, which is human reason should determine our understanding of the world. So I could ask, what is reason? If we're in class, we could have a discussion. What do we mean by reason? What's reasonable? Well, really, when we talk about reason in this sense, we mean think rationally about the world, be skeptical of traditional and existing explanations, and base your own well thought out views on logic and or empirical evidence, right? There's the scientific method coming in. So skepticism towards traditional political authority and traditional social structures is a big part of this, that we're questioning things like the divine right of kings, like monarchical absolutism. We're questioning why the aristocracy and the nobility have more rights than other classes of people. We're questioning why the middle classes and maybe even the lower classes, and some people, maybe even women or people of color, why they don't play a part in politics. You know, many great Enlightenment thinkers, some are from the upper classes, but a lot are from these growing middle classes. And these ideas are really sort of leading to the development of democratic politics. But part of this notion of human reason should determine our understanding of the world is also the application of the scientific method to understanding all aspects of life. So truth is found from this view through the application of reason and science, and not through religious faith or blind obedience to old authorities. And reason is not just to understand the natural world. So the scientific revolution was more about understanding the natural world through the development of today what we would call physics, astronomy, chemistry, medicine, that sort of thing, but also applying applying reason and the scientific method to the social world, to politics, government, economics, ethics, crime and punishment, social organization. This is really kind of, the Enlightenment gives us the foundation of the social science disciplines we have today: economics, political science, anthropology. This is really about social engineering in some ways, changing society for the better, purportedly, through reason. But how far should reforms go? How much should society be changed? And this is where you see sort of the division between radical and moderate Enlightenment thinkers. For example, we'll be talking about Kant, who actually was pretty moderate in terms of the politics that he supported. Not all Enlightenment thinkers supported what we think of as democracy. So that even if all humans are theoretically equal in their potential ability to use reason, many Enlightenment thinkers thought that only certain people should be able to have a say in politics. For example, like educated men who own property. So the idea of universal human reason in theory doesn't necessarily mean that everybody should get a say in politics for all Enlightenment thinkers. But contrast this with a more radical Enlightenment thinker such as the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a French Enlightenment intellectual born in an aristocratic family who was much more radical than most. He supported the equality of women in all races. He supported public education, constitutional democratic governments, and he's a major participant in the French Revolution. And he famously said in his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, "The time will therefore come when the sun will shine not only on free man, who knows no other master but their reason, when tyrants and slaves, priests and their stupid or hypocritical instruments will exist only in works of history and on the stage, and when we shall think of them only to pity their victims and their dupes, to maintain ourselves in a state of vigilance by thinking on their excesses, and to learn how to recognize and so destroy by force of reason the first seeds of tyranny and superstition, should they ever dare to reappear among us." And of course, not just sort of more people in privileged positions like Condorcet are advocating these kinds of ideas, but we're going to talk about individuals like Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a woman, sort of advocating for female reason. We're going to talk about, in a later class, enslaved peoples in the Americas using the sort of language of rights and the Enlightenment to demand their own freedom, right? So this language is there, and people are using it. Marginalized peoples are using it to articulate for their freedom, even during the Enlightenment. A final aspect of this notion of human reason should determine our understanding of the world is the idea that human reason is universal. All human beings possess the ability to use reason and become enlightened. In other words, humans are naturally equal from this perspective. Differences between individuals are less important than their fundamental sameness of rational beings. So this becomes the basis for Enlightenment ideas about political equality, right? All men are created equal, says the Declaration of Independence. Of course, men, right? But even if we sort of put that issue aside, this principle is implied very inconsistently and to the exclusion of some groups and individuals, which is justified during the Enlightenment and for the next 200 years. So the poor and lower classes are often excluded, women, people of color, and other ethnic and racial groups, what we today would call LGBTQI individuals. And these contradictions are visible throughout many of the major works by Enlightenment thinkers themselves. We'll talk about that in a later week about Thomas Jefferson. But for example, the US Constitution legally guarantees the rights and liberties of individuals, men, while simultaneously condoning slavery and counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. So how legitimate are Enlightenment arguments for human freedom, since they were in no way applied universally at the time, and many people articulating these ideas are giant hypocrites? And that's a huge question that we're going to be dealing with the next few weeks and throughout the semester. I think a really interesting way to sort of think about this contradiction at the heart of the Enlightenment, the ideals versus how they're not really carried out to their full potential, is this image of Thomas Jefferson by the artist Titus Kaphar. It's called Behind the Myth of Benevolence. And so, we can think about what is the myth of benevolence. This sort of classic idea of the benevolent slaveholder, right? Thomas Jefferson at Monticello had hundreds of slaves, maybe even more than that. But if we even think of household slaves, there's dozens of slaves that he's interacting with every day. And there's sort of this notion of, the kind and loving sort of owner, right? I mean, we know that's a bunch of crap now, but still, there's this notion of someone like Thomas Jefferson as being a benevolent slaveholder, right? And I think this image is really interesting because Thomas Jefferson's face is sort of fallen away. This curtain that his face on, that myth is being exposed. The curtain is falling, and what's behind him? A woman, and we could see an enslaved woman. She's in a very sort of, you could say, intimate situation. It's unclear if she's clothed other than her headscarf. The pitcher of water and the on the left side and the bowl on the bottom indicate that this is probably like a bedroom or a bedchamber, a very kind of intimate space. And, what is that myth that's being exposed? There's a few levels here. One, Jefferson's ability to have sort of economic success, Jefferson's ability to have the time to engage in political affairs and to become president of the United States, a lot of time was fundamentally predicated on the prosperity that the enslaved individuals he owned gave him. Right? He was able to do what he did because of the wealth and stability that they generated for him. But there's a more intimate thing going on here, which we will talk about in a later class. And I think there's a reference to the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a very long-standing relationship with an enslaved woman that he owned named Sally Hemings. Now, this woman, I think, is very consciously not meant to look like Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was actually biologically half-sister to Thomas Jefferson's dead white wife, because Sally Hemings' biological father was Thomas Jefferson's wife's father. And, what this demonstrates was sort of the generations of sexual exploitation of enslaved women. And we're going to talk about Sally Hemings more in another class. Thomas Jefferson fathered multiple children with her, and his descendants with Sally Hemings, the descendants through Sally Hemings still. The Hemings family is a prolific African-American family in the United States even today. So, this is this contradiction that's really at the heart of Enlightenment thinking and American Enlightenment. Is the curtain staying where it is, sort of half-half, or does it need to be ripped off? And how do we rip it off? How do we talk about these things? I don't think that we can just say thinkers like Jefferson were products of their time, and that ideas of even just equality of all white males were too radical for them, because there are other people that are articulating more radical notions of equality. But that also leads us to the question of, do we just keep gradually extending Enlightenment promises to more and more people? Do we just sort of add women in stir, add people of color in stir, add religious minorities in stir, add LGBTQI people in stir? Is still this kind of this picture of progress? Or does something fundamentally more need to change? Is there something sort of rotten at the core about these ideas? Or are they sort of good in theory, they were just put into practice badly? And that takes us to sort of the third core principle of the Enlightenment, which is the idea of progress, that humans can and should improve the material world, that there's a progressive movement to history, that life should get better over time with the application of reason to the human world. And that leads to a sense of optimism about the future. This theme gets returned to again and again in Western history. And I think this quote from from Benjamin Franklin, sort of another American Enlightenment figure, really is quite telling. He said, "The rapid progress of true science now occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried the power of man over matter. All diseases may sure means be prevented, and our lives lengthened at pleasure." And so if you were sitting in 1790 looking at 2020, you'd be amazed. You'd be absolutely amazed. I mean, maybe this quote isn't great in terms of diseases because we're in a pandemic, but you should also recognize that epidemics and even pandemics were a relatively common occurrence in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s and even into the early 1900s, that our lives are longer, they're healthier, they're more comfortable in terms of material comforts. But, are we happier? That's an important question. But how is progress defined? And that's really a central question too. Whose values, beliefs, and ideals are defined as progressive and whose are not? And who is in need of being, quote, civilized because of these notions of progress? And I want to look now at a famous painting by John Gast from 1872 called American Progress, right? So this is really sort of a metaphor for the spread of Western civilization across the North American continent. And so this allegorical female figure of progress, as she's moving from east to west, is bringing settlers, right? You can see the train, you can see wagons, you can see, European colonists, and light is coming with her, right? The clouds are moving from, the lightness is moving in and spreading out the dark clouds. And so this is supposed to be sort of from the perspective of people of European descent in 1872, a positive thing. This is representing the progress that they're seeing with westward expansion. But of course, we would ask, at what cost, right? The decimation of native peoples and cultures, right? How is civilization and progress defined? And what is sort of the violence endemic to that spread of, quote, progress? So, one thing we may want to think about is, does history actually move progressively? Do things get better over time, or is that just sort of a myth? Is modernity overall a good or bad thing for individuals, for societies, for the planet? I mean, that's something we'll be coming back to again and again this semester. So, in conclusion, there are really kind of two big questions that we can keep coming back to. One, what happened to the promise of the Enlightenment? The promise of the Enlightenment being that if we uphold the idea of individual liberty and we apply reason to the human world, to our understanding of the world, then things are going to get better, and that there is this belief in progress. What happened to the promise of the Enlightenment? Have we seen it increasingly realized or not? And is it something that we should even try to realize? And the second, I think, core set of questions is, can people who were initially excluded from these promises of rationality, of freedom and liberty be included into Western political and social systems? Can we use the ideals of the Enlightenment to achieve true freedom for all, or do we need new ideas? To paraphrase Black feminist thinker Audre Lorde, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house, or do we need completely new tools? Thanks, and I will see you next time.